The Moonstone Mass by Harriet Prescott Spofford. There was a certain weakness possessed by my ancestors, though in no wise peculiar to them, and of which, in common with other more or less undesirable traits, I have come into the inheritance. It was the fear of dying in poverty. That, too, in the face of a goodly share of pelf stored in stocks, and lands, and copper-bottomed clippers, or what stood for copper-bottomed clippers, or rather sailed for them, in the clumsy commerce of their times. There was one old fellow, in particular, his portrait is hanging over the hall stove today, leaning forward, somewhat blistered by the profuse heat and wasted fuel there, and as if, as long as such an outrageous expenditure of caloric was going on, he meant to have the full benefit of it, who is said to have frequently shed tears over the probable price of his dinner, and on the next day to have sent home a silver dish to eat it from at 100 times the cost. I find the inconsistencies of this individual constantly cropping out in myself, and although I could by no possibility be called a niggard, yet I confess that even now my prodigalities make me shiver. Some years ago I was the proprietor of the old family estate, unencumbered by anything except timber that is worth its weight in gold, yet, as you might say, alone in the world, save for an unloved relative, and with a sufficiently comfortable income, as I have since discovered, to meet all reasonable wants. I had, moreover, promised me in marriage the hand of a woman without a peer, and which, I believe now, might have been mine on any day when I saw fit to claim it. That I loved Eleanor tenderly and truly, you cannot doubt. That I desired to bring her home, to see her flitting here and there in my dark old house, illuminating it with her youth and beauty, sitting at the head of my table that sparkled with its gold and silver heirlooms, making my days and nights like one delightful dream, was just as true. And yet I hesitated. I looked over my bank book. I cast up my accounts. I have enough for one, I said. I am not sure that it is enough for two. Eleanor, daintily nurtured, requires as dainty care for all time to come. Moreover, it is not two alone to be considered, for should children come, there is their education, their maintenance, their future provision and portion to be found. All this would impoverish us, and unless we ended by becoming mere dependents, we had, to my excited vision, only the cold charity of the world and the workhouse to which to look forward. I do not believe that Eleanor thought me right in so much of the matter as I saw fit to explain, but in maiden pride her lips perforce were sealed. She laughed, though, when I confessed my workhouse fear, and said that for her part she was thankful there was such a refuge at all, standing as it did on its knoll in the midst of green fields, and shaded by broad-limbed oaks. She had always envied the old women sitting there by their evening fireside, and mumbling over their small affairs to one another. But all her words seemed merely idle badinage, so I delayed. I said, when this ship sails in, when that dividend is declared, when I see how this speculation turns out, the days were long that added up the count of years. The nights were dreary, but I believed that I was actuated by principle, and took pride to myself for my strength and self-denial. Moreover, old Paul, my great-uncle on my mother's side, and the millionaire of the family, was a bitter misogynist, and regarded women and marriage and household cares as the three remediless mistakes of an overruling providence. He knew of my engagement to Eleanor, but so long as it remained in that stage, he had nothing to say. Let me once marry, and my share of his million would be best represented by a cipher. However, he was not a man to adore, and he could not live forever. Still, with all my own effort, I amassed wealth but slowly. According to my standard, my various ventures had various luck. And one day my old Uncle Paul, always intensely interested in the subject, both scientifically and from a commercial point of view, too old and feeble to go himself, but fain to send a proxy, and desirous of money in the family, made me an offer of that portion of his wealth on my return which would be mine on his demise, funded safely subject to my order, provided I made one of those who sought the discovery of the Northwest Passage. I went to town, canvassed the matter with the experts. I had always an adventurous streak, as old Paul well knew, and having given many hours to the pursuit of the smaller sciences, had a turn for danger and discovery as well. And when the Albatross sailed, in spite of Eleanor's shivering remonstrance and prayers and tears, in spite of the grave looks of my friends, I was one of those that clustered on her deck, prepared for either fate. They, my companions, it is true, were led by nobler lights, but as for me, it was much as I told Eleanor. My affairs were so regulated that they would go on uninterruptedly in my absence. I should be no worse off for going, and if I returned, letting alone the renown of the thing, my Uncle Paul's donation was to be appropriated. Everything then was assured, and we stood possessed of lucky lives. If I had any keen or eager desire of search, any purpose to aid the growth of the world, or to penetrate the secrets of its formation, as indeed I think I must have had, I did not at that time know anything about it. But I was to learn that death and stillness have no kingdom on this globe, and that even in the extremest bitterness of cold and ice, perpetual interchange and motion is taking place. So we went, all sails set on favorable winds, bounding over blue sea, skirting frowning coasts, and ever pushing our way up into the dark mystery of the north. I shall not delay here to tell of Danish posts and the hospitality of summer settlements in their long afternoon of Arctic daylight, nor will I weary you with any description of the succulence of the radishes that grew under the panes of glass in the governor's scrap of moss and soil, scarcely of more size than a lady's parlour fernery, and which seemed to our dry mouths full of all the earth's cool juices. But advance, as we ourselves hastened to do, while that chill and crystalline sun shone up into the ice-cased dens and caverns of the pole. By the time that the long blue twilight fell, when the rough and rasping cold sheathed all the atmosphere, and the great stars pricked themselves out on the heavens like spears' points, the Albatross was hauled up for winter quarters, banked and boarded, heaved high on fields of ice, and all her inmates, during the wintry dark, led the life that prepared them for further exploits in higher latitudes the coming year, learning the dialects of the Eskimo, the tricks of the seal and walrus, making long explorations with the dogs and Glipnu, their master, breaking ourselves in for business that had no play about it. Then, at last, the August suns set us free again. Inlets of tumultuous water traversed the great ice-floes. The Albatross, refitted, ruffled all her plumage, and spread her wings once more for the north, for the secret that sat there, domineering all its substance. It was a year since we had heard from home, but who stayed to think of that, while our keel spurned into foam the sheets of steely seas, and day by day brought us nearer to the hidden things we sought? For myself, I confess that now, so close to the end as it seemed, curiosity and research absorbed every other faculty. Eleanor might be mouldering back to the parent earth. I could not stay to meditate on such a possibility. My Uncle Paul's donation might enrich itself with gold dust instead of the gathered dust of idle days. It was nothing to me. I had but one thought, one ambition, one desire in those days, the discovery of the clear seas and open passage. I endured all our hardships as if they had been luxuries. I made light of scurvy, banqueted off train oil, and met that cold, for which there is no language framed, and which might be a new element, or which, rather, had seemed in that long night like the vast void of ether beyond the uttermost star, where was neither air nor light nor heat, but only bitter negation and emptiness. I was hardly conscious of my body. I was only a concentrated search in myself. The recent explorers had announced here, in the neighborhood of where our third summer at last found us, the existence of an immense space of clear water. One even declared that he had seen it. My Uncle Paul had pronounced the declaration false, and the sight an impossibility. The north he believed to be the breeder of icebergs, an ever-welling fountain of cold. The great glaciers there forever form, forever fall. The ice packs line the gorges from year to year unchanging. Peaks of volcanic rock drop their frozen mantles like a scale, only to display the fresher one beneath. The whole region, said he, is plutonic, blasted by a primordial convulsion of the great forces of creation, and though it may be a few miles nearer to the central fires of the earth, allowing that there are such things, yet that would not in itself detract from the frigid power of its sunless solitudes. The more especially when it is remembered that the spinning of the earth, while in its first plastic material, which gave it greater circumference and thinness of shell at its equator, must have thickened the shell correspondingly at the poles, and the character of all the waste and wilderness there only signifies the impenetrable wall between its surface and center, through which wall no heat could enter or escape. The great rivers, like the White and the Mackenzie, emptying to the north of the continents, so far from being enough in themselves to form any body of ever fresh and flowing water, can only pierce the opposing ice fields in narrow streams and bays and inlets as they seek the Atlantic and the Pacific seas. And as for the theory of the currents of water heated in the tropics and carried by the rotary motion of the planet to the pole, where they rise and melt the ice floes into this great supposititious sea, it is simply an absurdity on the face of it, he argued, when you remember that warm water, being in its nature specifically lighter than cold, it would have risen to the surface long before it reached there. No, thought my Uncle Paul, who took nothing for granted, it is, as I said, an absurdity on the face of it. My nephew shall prove it, and I stake half the earnings of my life upon it. To tell the truth, I thought much the same as he did, and now that such a mere trifle of distance intervened between me and the proof, I was full of a feverish impatience that almost amounted to insanity. We had proceeded but a few days, coasting the crushing capes of rock that everywhere seemed to run out in a diablerie of tusks and horns to drive us from the region that they warded, now cruising through a runlet of blue water just wide enough for our keel, with silver reaches of frost stretching away into a ghastly horizon, now plunging upon tossing seas, the sun wheeling round and never sinking from the strange, weird sky above us, when again to our lookout a glimmer in the low horizon told its awful tale, a sort of smoky lustre like that which might ascend from an army of spirits, the fierce and fatal spirits, tented on the terrible field of the ice-floe. We were alone, our single little ship speeding ever upward in the midst of that untravelled desolation. We spoke seldom to one another, oppressed with the sense of our situation. It was a loneliness that seemed more than a death in life, a solitude that was supernatural. Here and now it was clear water, 10 hours later, and we were caught in the teeth of the cold, wedged in the ice that had advanced upon us and surrounded us, fettered by another winter in latitudes where human life had never before been supported. We found, before the hands of the dial had taught us the lapse of a week, that this would be something not to be endured. The sun sank lower every day behind the crags and silvery horns, the heavens grew to wear a hue of violet, almost black, and yet unbearably dazzling. As the notes of our voices fell upon the atmosphere, they assumed a metallic tone, as if the air itself had become frozen from the beginning of the world, and they tinkled against it. Our sufferings had mounted in their intensity till they were too great to be resisted. It was decided at length, when the one long day had given place to its answering night, and in the jet-black heavens the stars, like knobs of silver, sparkled so large and close upon us that we might have grasped them in our hands, that I should take a sledge with Glipnu and his dogs, and to see if there were any path to the westward, by which, if the Albatross were forsaken, those of her crew that remained might follow it, and find an escape to safety. Our path was on a frozen sea. If we discovered land, we did not know that the foot of man had ever trodden it. We could hope to find no cache of snow-buried food. Neither fish nor game lived in this desert of ice that was so devoid of life in any shape as to seem dead itself. But well provisioned, furred to the eyes, and essaying to nurse some hopefulness of heart, we set out on our way through this valley of death, relieving one another and traveling day and night. Still night and day to the west rose the black coast, one interminable height. To the east extended the sheets of unbroken ice. Sometimes a huge glacier hung pendulous from the precipice. Once we saw, by the starlight, a white, foaming, rushing river arrested and transformed to ice in its flight down that steep. A south wind began to blow behind us. We travelled on the ice 3 days, perhaps, as days are measured among men, had passed, when we found that we made double progress, for the ice travelled too. The whole field, carried by some northward bearing current, was afloat. It began to be crossed and cut by 1,000 crevices. The cakes, an acre each, tilted up and down, and made wide waves, with their ponderous plashing in the black body of the sea. We could hear them grinding distantly in the clear dark against the coast, against each other. There was no retreat, there was no advance. We were on the ice, and the ice was breaking up. Suddenly we rounded a tongue of the primeval rock, and recoiled before a narrow gulf, one sharp shadow, as deep as despair, as full of aguish fears. It was just wide enough for the sledge to span. Glipnu made the dogs leap. We could be no worse off if they drowned. They touched the opposite block. It careened. It went under. The sledge went with it. I was left alone where I had stood. 2 dogs broke loose and scrambled up beside me. Glipnu and the others I never saw again. I sank upon the ice. The dogs crouched beside me. Sometimes I think they saved my brain from total ruin, for without them I could not have withstood the enormity of that loneliness, a loneliness that it was impossible should be broken, floating on and on with that vast journeying company of spectral ice. I had food enough to support life for several days to come in the pouch at my belt. The dogs and I shared it, for, last as long as it would, when it should be gone, there was only death before us, no reprieve, sooner or later that, as well sooner as later. The living terrors of this icy hell were all about us, and death could be no worse. Still the south wind blew. The rapid current carried us. The dark skies grew deep and darker. The lanes and avenues between the stars were crowded with forebodings. For the air seemed full of a new power, a strange and invisible influence, as if a king of unknown terrors here held his awful state. Sometimes the dogs stood up and growled and bristled their shaggy hides. I, prostrate on the ice, in all my frame was stung with a universal tingle. I was no longer myself. At this moment my blood seemed to sing and bubble in my veins. I grew giddy with a sort of delirious and inexplicable ecstasy. With another moment unutterable horror seized me. I was plunged and weighed down with a black and suffocating load, while evil things seemed to flap their wings in my face, to breathe in my mouth, to draw my soul out of my body, and carry it careering through the frozen realm of that murky heaven, to restore it with a shock of agony. once as I lay there, still floating northward, out of the dim, dark rim of the water-world, a lance of piercing light shot up the zenith. It divided the heavens like a knife. They opened out in one blaze, and the fire fell sheetingly down before my face. Cold fire, curdlingly cold. Light robbed of heat, and set free in a preternatural anarchy of the elements, its fringes swung to and fro before my face, prickled it with flaming spiculæ, dissolving in 1,000 colors that spread everywhere over the low field, flashing, flickering, creeping, reflecting, gathering again in one long serpentine line of glory that wavered in slow convolutions across the cuts and crevices of the ice, wreathed ever nearer, and, lifting its head at last, became nothing in the darkness but 2 great eyes, like glowing coals, with which it stared me to astound, till I threw myself face down to hide me in the ice, and the whining, bristling dogs cowered backward and were dead. I should have supposed myself to be in the region of the magnetic pole of the sphere, if I did not know that I had long since left it behind me. My pocket compass had become entirely useless, and every scrap of metal that I had about me had become a lodestone. The very ice, as if it were congealed from water that held large quantities of iron in solution, iron escaping from whatever solid land there was beneath or around, the plutonic rock that such a region could have alone veined and seamed with metal. The very ice appeared to have a magnetic quality. It held me so that I changed my position upon it with difficulty, and, as if it established a battery by the aid of the singular atmosphere above it, frequently sent thrills quivering through and through me, till my flesh seemed about to resolve into all the jarring atoms of its original constitution, and again soothed me, with a velvet touch, into a state which, if it were not sleep, was at least haunted by visions that I dare not believe to have been realities, and from which I always awoke with a start to find myself still floating. My watch had long since ceased to beat. I felt an odd persuasion that I had died when that stood still, and only this slavery of the magnet, of the cold, this power that locked everything in invisible fetters and let nothing loose again, held my soul still in the bonds of my body. Another idea also took possession of me, for my mind was open to whatever visitant chose to enter, since utter despair of safety or release had left it vacant of a hope or fear. These enormous days and nights, swinging in their arc 6 months long, were the pendulum that dealt time in another measure than that dealt by the sunlight of lower zones. They told the time of what interminable years, the years of what vast generations far beyond the span that covered the age of the primeval men of Scripture. They measured time on this gigantic and enduring scale for what wonderful and mighty beings, old as the everlasting hills, as destitute as they of mortal sympathy, cold and inscrutable, handling the 2-edged javelins of frost and magnetism, and served by all the unknown polar agencies. I fancied that I saw their far-reaching cohorts, marshalling and maneuvering at times in the field of a horizon that was boundless, the glitter of their spears and casques, the sheen of their white banners, and again, sitting in fearful circle with their phantasmagoria, they shut and hemmed me in, and watched me writhe like a worm before them. I had a fancy that the perpetual play of magnetic impulses here gradually disintegrated myself to any further fear. I cowered beneath the stare of those dead and icy eyes. Slowly we rounded and ever rounded the inside on which my place was, moving less slowly than the outer circle of the sheeted mass in its viscid flow. And as we moved, by some fate, my eye was caught by the substance on which this figure sat. It was no figure at all now, but a bare jag of rock rising in the center of this solid whirlpool, and carrying on its summit something which held a light that not one of these icy freaks pranking in the dress of gems and flowers had found it possible to assume. It was a thing so real, so genuine, my breath became suspended, my heart ceased to beat. My brain, that had been a lump of ice, seemed to move in its skull. Hope that had deserted me suddenly sprung up like a second life within me. The old passion was not dead, if I was. It rose stronger than life or death or than myself. If I could but snatch that mass of moonstone, that inestimable wealth. It was nothing deceptive, I declared to myself. What more natural home could it have than this region, thrown up here by the old plutonic powers of the planet, as the same substance in smaller shape was thrown upon the peaks of the Mount St. Gothard when the Alpine aiguille first sprang into the day. There it rested, limpid with its milky pearl, casting out flakes of flame and azure, of red and leaf-green light, and holding yet a sparkle of silver in the reflections and refractions of its inner axis. The splendid Turk's eye of the lapidaries, the cousin of the water opal and the girasole, the precious essence of feldspar. Could I break it, I would find clusters of great hemitrope crystals. Could I obtain it, I should have a jewel in that mass of moonstone, such as the world never saw. The throne of Jamshid would not cast a shadow beside it. Then the bitterness of my fate overwhelmed me. Here, with this treasure of a kingdom, this jewel that could not be priced, this wealth beyond an emperor's, and here, only to die. My stolid apathy vanished, old thoughts dominated once more, old habits, old desires. I thought of Eleanor then, in her warm, sunny home, the blossoms that bloomed around her, the birds that sang, the cheerful evening fires, the longing thoughts for one who never came, who never was to come. But I would, I cried, where human voice had never cried before. I would return. I would take this treasure with me. I would not be defrauded. Should not I, a man, conquer this inanimate, blind matter? I reached out my hands to seize it. Slowly it receded, slowly and less slowly. Or was the motion of the ice still carrying me onward? Had we encircled this apex, and were we driving out into the open and uncovered north, and so down the seas and out to the open main of black water again? If so, if I could live through it, I must have this thing. I rose, and as well as I could, with my cramped and stiffened limbs, I moved to go back for it. It was useless. The current that carried us was growing invincible. The gaping gulfs of the outer seas were sucking us toward them. I fell. I scrambled to my feet. I would still have gone back, but as I attempted it, the ice whereon I was inclined, ever so slightly, tipped more boldly, gave way, and rose in a billow, broke, and piled over on another mass beneath. Then the cavern was behind us, and I comprehended that this ice stream, having doubled its central point, now in its outward movement encountered the still incoming body, and was to pile above and pass over it, the whole expanse bending, cracking, breaking, crowding, and compressing, till its rearing tumult made bergs more mountainous than the offshot glaciers of the Greenland continent, that should ride safely down to crumble in the surging seas below. As block after block of the rent ice rose in the air, lighted by the blue and bristling aurora points, toppled and mounted higher, it seemed to me that now indeed I was battling with those elemental agencies in the dreadful fight I desired, one man against the might of matter. I sprang from that block to another. I gained my balance on a third, climbing, shouldering, leaping, struggling, holding with my hands, catching with my feet, crawling, stumbling, tottering, rising high and higher, with the mountain ever making underneath. A power unknown to my foes coming to my aid, a blessed rushing warmth that glowed on all the surface of my skin, that set the blood to racing in my veins, that made my heart heat with newer hope, sink with newer despair, rise buoyant with new determination. Except when the shaft of light pierced the shivering sky, I could not see or guess the height that I had gained. I was vaguely aware of chasms that were bottomless, of precipices that opened on them, of pinnacles rising round me in aerial spires, when suddenly the shelf on which I must have stood yielded, as if it were pushed by great hands, swept down a steep incline like an avalanche, stopped halfway, but sent me flying on, sliding, glancing like a shooting star, down the slippery side, breathless, dizzy, smitten with blistering pain by awful winds that whistled by me, far out upon the level ice below that tilted up and down again with the great resonant plash of open water, and conscious for a moment that I lay at last upon a fragment that the mass behind urged on. I knew, and I remembered nothing more. Faces were bending over me when I opened my eyes again, rough, uncouth, and bearded faces, but no monsters of the pole, whalemen rather, smelling richly of train oil, but I could recall nothing in all my life one fraction so beautiful as they. The angels on whom I hope to open my eyes when death has really taken me will scarcely seem sights more blessed than did those rude whalers of the North Pacific Sea. The North Pacific Sea, for it was there that I was found, explain it how you may, whether the albatross had pierced farther to the west than her sailing master knew, and had lost her reckoning with a disordered compass needle under new stars, or whether I had really been the sport of the demoniac beings of the ice, tossed by them from zone to zone in a dozen hours. The whalers, real creatures enough, had discovered me on a block of ice, they said, nor could I, in their opinion, have been many days undergoing my dreadful experience, for there was still food in my wallet when they opened it. They would never believe a word of my story, and so far from regarding me as one who had proved the Northwest Passage in my own person, they considered me a mere idle maniac. As uncomfortable a thing to have on shipboard as a ghost or a dead body, wrecked and unable to account for myself, and gladly transferred me to a homeward-bound Russian man-of-war, whose officers afforded me more polite but quite as decided skepticism. I have never to this day found anyone who believed my story when I told it, so you can take it for what it is worth. Even my Uncle Paul flouted it, and absolutely refused to surrender the sum on whose expectation I had taken ship, while my old ancestor, who hung peeling over the hall fire, dropped from his frame in disgust at the idea of one of his hard-cash descendants turning romancer. But all I know is that the albatross never sailed into port again, and that if I open my knife today and lay it on the table, it will wheel about till the tip of its blade points full at the North Star. I have never found anyone to believe me, did I say? Yes, there is one. Eleanor never doubted a word of my narration, never asked me if cold and suffering had not shaken my reason. But then, after the first recital, she had never been willing to hear another word about it, and if I ever allude to my lost treasure, or the possibility of instituting search for it, she asks me if I need more lessons to be content with the treasure that I have, and gathers up her work and gently leaves the room. So that now I speak of it so seldom, if I had not told the thing to you, it might come to pass that I should forget altogether the existence of my mass of moonstone. My mass of moonshine, old Paul calls it. I let him have his say. He cannot have that nor anything else much longer, but when all is done, I recall Galileo, and I mutter to myself, per se moi. It was a mass of moonstone. With these eyes I saw it, with these hands I touched it, with this heart I longed for it, with this will I mean to have it yet.